Good afternoon after this little IT upset, and welcome. We are delighted to be joined today by Dr. Georgina Dodge, Associate Vice President and Diversity Officer, and Dr. Benita Wolf, Associate Dean for Diversity from the College of Medicine. So thank you for joining us. I want to thank our other guests and the faculty and students and staff who could come to hear today's lecture. I am deeply honored to introduce Chancellor Dennis Shields of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. So on behalf of his teachers, my faculty colleagues, and the entire law school, warm welcome home to you, to Iowa, and to the College of Law. Chancellor Shields is a native of Iowa who graduated from this law school in the class of 1982. When we were talking about him earlier today, one of his teachers said to me, well, when he was a student, he was a clinic junkie. At lunch, when I was talking to him, he said to me it was just possible that he was not the most dedicated and prepared student in every one of his classrooms. But I can tell you I did not have to look at his GPA to know that what he was when he was a student and is now is a leader, and a very special kind of leader, a leader who is committed to service to others in all the communities in which he has found himself. After graduation, he stayed here at Iowa for nearly a decade. He served in a number of administrative roles with increasing responsibility, both at the law school and at the university. His leadership of our admissions office and his deep commitment to access to law schools for students from underrepresented groups has left a real and meaningful legacy in the practicing bar and the bench here in Iowa and well beyond. Today, when we were at lunch, Chancellor Shields said he took these values of Iowa, commitment to excellence, to opportunity, and to inclusiveness, with him throughout his career. That career, as you know, eventually led him away from Iowa to the University of Michigan and to Duke, both, you know, good but obviously inferior law schools. But he again had responsibility for admissions and for financial aid. He had a hand, I'm told, in crafting the admissions policy for the University of Michigan Law School that prevailed in Grutter versus Bollinger, and maybe he'll talk about that today. He served as dean and a professor of law at the Phoenix School of Law. And then, I think, even though we have known each other only briefly, I could already tell that this would be his reaction. He got a call from a friend, a fellow Iowan, President Greg Williams, then of the City College of New York, to help out, to act as acting vice president for student affairs. And once again, Chancellor Shields answered the call to service, and he went, leaving his family in Arizona. And he then became, from that position, Chancellor at Plattsville, where he is today, began in July. So that was something we had in common, the 4 months or 5 months of tenure. So I'm really excited to have him here to give this important lecture, and I ask you to join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks for that warm welcome, Dean. And it is an extraordinary pleasure for me to return home. This is where I come from, and I carry it with me. And you should know that wherever I go, one of the first things that people learn about me is that I'm from Iowa, and they should watch their attitude when they think about that. So I'm going to talk. I'm going to wax a little nostalgic, and so you'll have to bear with me through that. But I thank you, students, and faculty, colleagues, guests, for coming today. It is truly an honor to be here. and returned to the law school and the university where I received my professional training. It is humbling to have been asked to address this body on the occasion of honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. For unlike us, he didn't live to see the progress that we've seen to date in our society. Thus, we honor his legacy by acknowledging what has been accomplished and dedicating ourselves to overcome the challenges ahead. You know, higher education and legal education have a special role in society in seeking to expand knowledge by educating and training the next generation of leaders, by offering our service to our state and our country, and by assuring access to our institutions of higher education to the full range of our citizens. We follow the example set by Dr. King. And we have many achievements to acknowledge here at Iowa, and we also have a lot of challenges. I'd like to talk a little bit about both of those today. It occurs to me that as we engage in our celebration and discussion today, we should begin with a recollection of some of the history of this state, this law school, and the university at large with regard to diversity. The University of Iowa admitted students to study without regard to race or gender from the date of its founding. The Iowa Supreme Court was the first state court to support the proposition that public schools could not discriminate on the basis of race. That case was decided in 1868. The first African American to attend and graduate from this law school, Alexander Clark Jr., enrolled in 1878 and graduated in 1879. I've always thought about he only had 1 year of this. So. His father also received his law degree from Iowa in 1884. Now, I can't come back here without making some mention of that other state school a little west of here. But I also take significant pride in knowing that George Washington Carver received his higher education in this state and was a faculty member at Iowa State. My oldest son is named in his honor, and he was born in 1988. When I lived here and introduced him, people always ask me, why'd you name your son after Carver Hawkeye Arena? Wrong Carver. The National Bar Association, the oldest and largest organization of African American lawyers in this country, was founded in Des Moines in 1925. African American lawyers have been a vibrant part of the legal profession in this state for almost a century and a half. Some of the names, Gertrude Rush, S. Joe Brown, another graduate of this law school, Luther Glanton, and more recently people like Alfredo Parrish. I have sort of an interesting family background. I never knew my parents, but I discovered later in life that my father was a graduate of Drake Law School and went on to a distinguished career in Seattle, Washington. What this brief list tells us is that Iowa, its universities, and its legal profession have been open to diversity for a century and a half. The historical roots and values that we are gathered here to celebrate and champion have been in abundance in this state for a long time. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna. To be sure, all was not sweetness and light during the times that I mentioned these historical facts. And one doesn't need to look hard to find evidence of ugliness that was a part of those times in this state. It is, however, important to remember that in noteworthy ways, Iowa was in the forefront of the effort to have this society reflect the basic values central to our national ethos. A position of leadership argued for by our forefathers, which today stands as a beacon of enlightenment during unsure times. I'll tell you that this progressive legacy provided the context which informed the whole of my professional career. Indeed, my experience at the University of Iowa shaped the very person I am today. This molding started with the time as a student, and as the dean made mention on this point, the most charitable way to describe me as a student is to observe that I was remarkably unremarkable. And for some in the audience today, this news should provide some comfort. The commitment to teaching on the part of this faculty benefits both the brilliant and the pedestrian. Student learning is central to the educational enterprise here. Our law school has this built into its DNA. Likewise, service to the profession and the academy are equally critical to the role of a law school. And that is another thing that I witnessed during my 12 years here in abundance. And you have to understand, I'm an Iowan through and through. All that I have become is a result of the good graces of the people of this state. And it's one of the reasons why I'm most honored to have been invited to come speak today. I started at the Christ Child Home in Des Moines that housed, clothed, and fed me for the first 5 years of my life. I was raised through the support of the state of Iowa and Catholic Charities, educated by its schools, and through the kindnesses of so many people, survived to adulthood to begin my professional career at this law school. The support I received early in my career as a student and administrator at this law school was a result of the professionalism, personal care, and a fundamental commitment to a culture of achievement, created and nurtured by the faculty, administrators, and staff of our institution. This commitment to a culture of achievement is the hallmark of our law school. I would be remiss if I didn't mention some specific individuals who made a difference for me. And whenever you make a list, you always leave some people out, but I thought it was important to mention a few people. Barbara Schwartz, who had me as a student, supervised much of my clinical experience, and more importantly, worked closely with me on a number of committees here at the law school, was an especially valuable teacher and colleague. Gregory Williams, who's now the president of the University of Cincinnati, admitted me to this law school, hired me to work for him as a student, and was principally responsible for my first professional opportunity after law school when I began my career in law school admissions. I still count him as a friend and mentor to this day. His faith in me and good advice and counsel throughout my career have been of immeasurable value to me. Arthur Bonfield had a profound influence on me when I served as his teaching assistant at the Clio Institute 25 years ago. I was a recent college graduate, and he was particularly supportive of the notion that I was competent to do what he was asking me to do, even though I had some questions about that. David Vernon offered me an opportunity to serve in the central administration here and always gave me good advice. A lesson I learned from him was to argue passionately, but be quick to admit when you're wrong. Now, I think there's a few people in the room that remember David. You always got the truth from him, as he saw it, with no sugarcoating. But his honesty and intellectual integrity made a huge difference to me, and no doubt to this law school and university through his service over many years as a dean, professor, and central administrator. Professor Charles Davidson taught me a great deal about the care one needs to take in making admissions decisions. Every candidate file he read received a thorough reading, and he read thousands of them. I never once heard him say an unkind word about any candidate. It was clear it pained him whenever he could not vote in support of a candidate. And finally, Nancy Wetstein, who I'm glad is here today. She was an assistant when I was a pilgrim, just trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing in the admissions office. And during my 10 years in that office, Nancy was fiercely loyal, intensely hardworking, and incredibly competent in the finest sense of that word. I celebrate the involvement of these folks in my life to underscore the notion that it is the overall culture of an institution that drives outcomes. The culture impacts teaching and service as well as scholarship, and each is critical in the area of diversity. It is the service to the profession and the academy that animated the diversity efforts of this law school. Since the late 1960s, this law school has been a leader in diversity. Professor Paul Newhouser was an early advocate for a larger effort to recruit a more diverse student body. And Dean David Vernon brought an active recruitment effort to life, and the faculty was soon responsible for hiring the first African-American law professor, George Strait. The culture and outcomes at this college sprang from the legacy of Dean Mason Ladd, who was responsible for recruiting the core of the faculty in the 50s and 60s. The professors Dean Ladd recruited are still profoundly influencing the direction of this law school. When Bill Hines took over the deanship in the 1970s, there was one woman and no people of color on the faculty. Students of color made up a small fraction of the enrollment. Under his leadership and with the support of the faculty, a remarkable 27 years of expanding diversity occurred. Student diversity reached nearly 30% in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and women on the faculty increased tremendously. By the late 1980s, the diversity of this law school was the envy of legal education, and I am proud to have served the law school under Bill's leadership. Now, lawyers play a significant role in protecting and advancing the civil rights of Americans. An example is in Birmingham, Alabama. The local police arrested Dr. King, but it was a collection of local lawyers that secured his freedom. We are aware of the words that he wrote during those days in jail, but his vision was inspired not only by what happened to him and his dreams, but also his understanding of the actions of those that fought tirelessly for his freedom so that he could continue his march. Lawyers today, as our predecessors then, serve as the partners in a symbiotic relationship with the voices that shape the future path of our nation. Now, I decided to go to law school and become a lawyer because I wanted to make a difference. A good friend and mentor of mine first planted the seed in my mind about becoming a lawyer when I was a sophomore in college. The thought of becoming a lawyer sat in the back of my mind until I read a book in my senior year of college by Richard Kluger called Simple Justice. This book told the story of the 1954 case, and cases is more than one case, 5 of them, Brown versus the Board of Education. I found the explanation of the legal doctrines on which the Brown case relied fascinating. However, I found the stories of the individuals involved in the cases inspiring and even more compelling. The book goes into great detail about the lives of the plaintiffs, the lawyers, and the judges, and other significant actors in the drama of the case. These stories resonated with me, and they resonate with me still, because my own life had been so influenced by hundreds of moments of assistance from individuals. In most of the instances, these people had no personal stake in my future other than their own moral compass that moved them to help someone in need. In too many instances, history does not do justice nor make note of those who profoundly influence the course of human events, let alone seminal legal cases, simply by displaying small acts of courage in their day-to-day life. Each of the plaintiffs in these cases, generally children and their parents, had much to lose by stepping forward. They lost jobs, they lost social standing, and in many cases, their personal safety was threatened. The same was true for many of the lawyers and trial judges who had the courage to step up and do the right thing. It was the day-to-day courage I read about in Simple Justice that inspired me to become a lawyer. The message I took from the book was that I could make a difference, even in a small way, and that it was dependent upon what I did day to day. I entered law school in 1979, not long after the Bakke case was decided. I followed that case closely because it was winding its way through the court system about the time I was reading Simple Justice. In my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined of ever being involved in the next seminal Supreme Court case that had to do with law school admission. I'll digress for a moment here and tell you, when I got to law school in 1979, there were several professors of color, Barry Matsumoto, Greg Williams, George Strait, as well as a number of women on the faculty. The student body had a healthy number of students of color and women. From what I can tell, this was not accomplished by any grand gesture, program, or the like, but rather by the pragmatic leadership of the faculty and the administration of this school in the preceding years. The presence of this amount of diversity in Iowa, of all places, was evidence of a persistent and ongoing commitment to diversity. Was it perfect? No. Life never is. But the law school was ahead of the curve in the legal academy nationally. In the daily hurly-burly of the life of the school, did issues come up? Yes. But that did not cause this law school to cut and run from its commitment to diversity. Over my time at the law school, I witnessed the addition of its first Hispanic professors and openly gay professors, and its success at attracting more women to the faculty. By all evidence, this commitment to diversity in the faculty continues to this day. The legacy of these efforts is the men and women of color who have populated, like Joe Knight and James Anaya, and those who continue to populate this fine faculty of this fine law school, like Barry Matsumoto, Angelana Wichi-Willig, Marcella David, Adrian Wing, and Enrique Carrasco. This commitment is evident in ongoing programs like the Philip G. Hubbard Law School Preparation Program. I'm honored to say that I spent a year working with Dr. Hubbard when I worked in the central administration here. Now, one of my great fortunes was that I was able to spend a number of years working at this school after studying here. The student perspective is, by its very nature, a bit narrow. Students rarely get to peek behind the curtain and become cognizant of all the effort that goes into the development of policies and procedures and practices in the operation of a school. For nearly 10 years, beginning in my third year of law school, I worked with faculty and administrators on a daily basis. My responsibility was recruiting a talented, diverse student body to the law school and then helping students through that process. I came to know a substantial portion of the faculty in a meaningful way. I learned there are rewards to serving as the dean of a law school. But I also witnessed up close the trials and tribulations of the job by observing a lot of what Bill Hines had to deal with. Many years later, when Greg Williams suggested that I think about becoming a law school dean, my immediate response was, that doesn't sound like a fun job. It is a tribute to the character of Bill Hines that he was steadfast in his commitment to diversity, even when it wasn't fun, and he was absorbing criticism from every direction. His calmness and his refusal to hold a grudge is something that I try to emulate in my current position. We had great success during my time as the admissions officer here in attracting a more diverse student body. That success came about through the hard work of many people. It came from the impressive involvement by professors who served on the admissions committee over those years. It came from the resources the law school and the university put into supporting the effort, and it came from the energy we put into programs like Bridging the Gap. Again, this is not to say there weren't challenges that arose as we came to grips with issues as our diversity expanded. These times were not always easy, but we persevered. My greatest inspiration from those days is the success of students of color who came to this law school and who, in concert with the educational process of this school, graduated and went on to much success in the following years. Hardly a month goes by when I do not hear from or learn about a success or particular achievement by a member of that generation of graduates from this law school. The lessons I learned during those times have stood me in good stead. The day-to-day effort we put into delivering the kind of educational experience in the classroom, in the makeup of our faculty, in dealing with tense times, upon reflection, take me back to when I read and was inspired by Simple Justice. More importantly for me professionally was the education I received on issues of diversity through these experiences at this law school. I was a defendant in Grutter v. Bollinger. I was the lowest ranking one. Regents, president, dean, director of admissions. One area of my experience at Iowa that proved to be prescient, given what was to come later, was the shaping of my views on the development and implementation of admissions decision-making, policies and processes. The wisdom and integrity of the process that I learned from the likes of Greg Williams, Barb Schwartz, Bill Hines, Charles Davidson, and others at the Iowa Law School was critical to preparing me for what I would confront at Michigan in drafting and administering the admissions policy and in participating in the lawsuit. At Michigan, as we drafted and implemented the policy that was challenged and ultimately found constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, I was continually reminded of the approach I was immersed in at this law school. As I waited for the decision from the court to be delivered in the summer of 2003, I was calm and sort of ambivalent. This ambivalence was driven by the fact that though I cared very deeply about the result, I knew the work of making universities more diverse was not going to be easy, no matter the outcome of the case. If we prevailed in the case, it was not as if it would become noticeably easier to maintain the progress we had attained thus far. And if we lost, I was confident that the commitment of higher education to diversity would not slacken, it would just have to change. My role in this case was in helping to draft the admissions policy and then implementing it. The drafting was complete in 1992, and the lawsuit was filed in 1997. I think there were a number of factors that led to the successful defense of the policy and its implementation. Excellent lawyering, a huge commitment of money, time, and energy on the part of the university, great leadership by the university president, Lee Bollinger, the relative autonomy of the university, both fiscally and politically, and adherence to the policy as I made admissions decision. For me, explaining to the court and others the process of drafting the policy was central to persuading a majority of the court to find in our favor. The plaintiff tried mightily to find a flaw in our approach, but the rigor and thoroughness of our efforts left no smoking gun of alleged unconstitutionality. The admissions decision-making process at Michigan prior to my arrival had not called for much faculty involvement in reading files. Only a small subset of admissions candidate files were reviewed by a committee each year in the preceding decade. The committee that drafted the policy, as a part of developing that policy, reviewed several hundred files selected by me. That experience informed the committee's drafting of the policy. The holistic review of each file as a part of the decision-making process and the evidence that such a review was in fact how the policy was implemented, I believe, was a significant factor in the court's decision in our favor. This regime of individual review is what I brought with me from my experience at this law school. While great headway has been made here and across the country since Brown, Bakke, and Grutter, the interplay of cultural competency at the university level and our pervasive national culture is dynamic. So what are the challenges ahead of us in higher education? And what should we in higher education be doing? How does the effort to provide a welcoming and diverse environment on our campuses relate to those challenges? As I considered the arguments litigated in Grutter, I thought the public discourse was often too narrow. This discourse cries out for a broader and deeper policy considerations than the narrower constitutional arguments meant to win over the justices. There are, in fact, numerous interconnected rationales for why higher education requires broad diversity. We start by recognizing that the need for an educated population in this country has never been greater, as the global competition for jobs and innovation is intense and getting more intense. If we are to revive our manufacturing base, continue to lead the world in innovation, and have our economy have a long-term healthy growth, then ever-increasing numbers of our children and young adults must be well educated. My role as Chancellor at the UW-Platteville has caused me to spend a lot of time with business, industry, and government leaders. All have expressed the need for our workforce to be able to work across cultural lines, be nimble in adjusting to new conditions, and possess the ability to adapt skills to new opportunities and technologies seamlessly. It seems to me that this requires an education that equips our students to thrive in a multicultural, pluralistic society. There are a number of challenges to this if we are to achieve the educational outcomes I described. First, we have a prospective student population that is becoming ever more diverse. This year at the University of Texas, it enrolled its first class where majority students were in the minority. And while Texas is on the leading edge of this trend, other universities will have to experience this phenomena in the not too distant future if they are to thrive and prosper. In addition, today's student population is in many ways less prepared for college. The students who are available to populate our institutions do not lack motivation or ability, but many will come from educational experiences that leave them poorly prepared for college curriculum. We also have a society that is, in many assessments, even more segregated educationally at the K-12 level than at any point in this nation's history. Therefore, many of our students arrive on our campuses with few personal interactions with and little knowledge of persons who differ from themselves by race, religion, ethnicity, country of origin, or sexual orientation. They arrive on our campuses having had little chance to understand, tolerate, or discuss views that are different from their personal experience in significant ways. This inwardly directed set of experiences in many ways mirrors our current American culture, and as a result, American politics is polarized. This is not the first time our nation has arrived at such a crossroads. As Dr. King observed in his letter from Birmingham jail, too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in tragic effort to live in a monologue rather than a dialogue. This breeds a lack of respect for disagreement and lends itself to monologue rather than dialogue. So looking forward, first, we as educators have a primary responsibility to create and maintain a culture of achievement. As we look forward and I provide some thoughts on where I think we ought to go, you need to know it's colored by my experience of 25 years in law school admissions and the last couple of years in a broader university setting. Over the course of those years, I spent a lot of time on a lot of different campuses, but I spent a lot of time in high schools. Colleges and universities, not to mention graduate and professional schools, are at the end of the educational pipeline. Students that populate our programs have spent at least 13 years in our school systems prior to becoming candidates for our programs. I've seen both in two different settings, at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville and at City College in New York. Different student bodies, but coming from the same place. First-generation college students, not from wealthy backgrounds, with challenging from kindergarten to 12th grade educations. All of us in higher education know that to be successful, learners must be intellectually engaged in the enterprise. In many instances, our college-bound students have no clue what that means. The foundation of learning, in my view, is the will to learn and acquire knowledge and skills. It is our charge as educators to create conditions which produce this result. Now, our colleges and universities know this, but too often would rather focus selfishly on what makes our institutions look better. We all accept that ability is one trait that is needed to succeed. However, character, motivation, and perspiration are often more important than ability. We have become so fixated on standardized test scores and on what those scores say about our students, and more importantly, what they say about our institutions, that we discount the other aspects of a person that in many cases have a more profound impact on learning and success. Much of higher education is afflicted with this illness, and legal education has this sickness in abundance. We'd rather chase candidates that have already demonstrated high ability because it makes us look better, and in many cases, those students are easier to teach. We bemoan the unpreparedness and lack of motivation of students instead of facing reality and building our programs to address this problem. This fall, I had the opportunity to tour a public school system, Aldine, in Houston, Texas. We need to, in higher education, nurture and support those kinds of systems. It's largely Hispanic and Black, about 60-30 Hispanic and 60% Hispanic and 30% Black, in a low socioeconomic area. I spent a day touring the system last fall. I visited 6 schools during that day, starting with a pre-K school and ending at a science and technology high school named after George Washington Carver. I toured the system with an administrator who has a great passion and personal commitment to the success of every from the core in the system. At Aldine, they start talking, and I saw this happen, about college with their students in the pre-K program. Aldine is committed to creating a culture of achievement for their students. Not only do they engage their students, they also engage the parents in the process, and this is extraordinarily important. The Aldine school system has created the very conditions which provide the will to learn, the desire to strive, and the skill set to achieve. A culture of achievement means that we hold our colleges and universities accountable for teaching all students, not just the ones they wish they had. A culture of achievement sets clear standards for students. I'm sort of old school in this sense, and a few years ago I hired a graduate of this law school to work for me in Phoenix, and she commented on how I seem to have mellowed over the years and how scary I was back when she was in school. But what I would say to people was, go to class, do the homework, get help when you need it, don't make excuses. There's all kinds of reasons that you can find to not succeed. What you need to find is a reason to succeed. This approach sets high goals and urges our students to strive to achieve them. Our colleges should make clear to both faculty and students that there is accountability and responsibility on both their parts, and it is a personal responsibility. The leadership and the teachers at Aldine School District have accomplished this by placing a premium on a resolute commitment to their students. I emphasize that there is a personal, day-to-day commitment to their educational endeavor. Nothing magical about it. Second, we as educators need to passionately emphasize diversity. The students from Aldine, when they go off to college, are coming from a de facto segregated school system. They will be entering college like many of their peers from other school systems where their experience has been fairly homogeneous. So colleges and universities have two challenges on this front. Higher education is required to provide for the students academically and then prepare them to succeed in a much more diverse setting, both on the campus and as they go out into the world. And as the world continues to become more complex, I believe there are some baseline values that drive our society. Values that such as good citizenship driven by an informed population requires an educated society that has an outwardly focused sense of awareness. Given this, we must as a society, and in particular institutions of higher education, teach our students to understand the beliefs of others, become aware of different life experiences that shape the perspectives of others, and begin to build the skills they need not just to survive in today's society, but to thrive. To do this is a two-part approach. First, a solid grounding in liberal arts. I'm a huge believer in that. Will help accomplish this. Music, art, history, math, all of those things ought to be a part of every student's education. A multidisciplinary academic approach to the education of our students will achieve two fundamental goals. It will impart the wisdom that comes from self-awareness of the limits of one's personal experiences and create the understanding that an awareness of the wide range of other human experiences does not mean one must give up their own beliefs and values. Second, the clearest and surest way to start is by providing an educational environment that reflects the value of diversity through the diversities of our faculty, in the leadership of our colleges and universities, and in our student bodies. This diversity is easily described, but harder to achieve, and it takes vigilance like that sustained by this law school and university over the past 40 years. It is not achieved through a grand gesture or merely establishing programs, but rather by consciously pursuing opportunities to create a diverse educational environment. Yes, we need to be pragmatic and balance diversity with other concerns. However, we must also continuously monitor the environment and make adjustments when necessary. Achieving the goal of greater diversity is not rocket science. Rather, it is a basic proposition of actively recruiting and hiring qualified individuals from all walks of life on a consistent and sustained pace. Pursuing this approach, one based upon consistent and persistent action, recognizes, as Dr. King did, that progress is achieved when we build upon the foundation of our predecessors. We, like those before us, must stand on their shoulders, the shoulders of giants, as we reach higher. In this way, we will continue the collective efforts of building upon the experience of others, realizing their value and their worth as we strive forward. We also need to work diligently day to day to provide a welcoming environment to all who enter our educational institutions. In some ways, this is the harder task because it means imbuing the culture with a personal responsibility to welcome what has been called the other. It requires a humility of mind and spirit which goes against the prevailing culture of boasting about the importance of who we are and what we are. Let me give you an example. This summer, at the final group meal with some Chinese scholars on my campus prior to their departure, a senior administrator noted that the scholars would be visiting Washington, D.C., New York City, and Boston before they returned to China. He admonished our guests to remember that the real America was the America they had experienced in Platteville. Now, one would be hard-pressed to find anyone who's more proud of his or her Midwestern roots than me. I've lived in Michigan, North Carolina, Arizona, and New York since I left Iowa almost 20 years ago. But Iowa or Wisconsin is no more or less the real America than New York, North Carolina, Arizona, or Michigan. A sense of personal modesty is, I think, required in these instances. Understanding this, we readily see that the American experience is a rich tapestry of diverse individuals both in thought and origin, pluralistic ethnic groups, and geographic locations. Each is different and equally a part of the American mosaic. We can all rightly take pride in our roots, but in so doing should not elevate ourselves and our experiences above the lives and experiences of others who happen to live or come from other places. This humility must emanate from a personal commitment that is lived day to day by each of us. That, I believe, will make the world a better place. It's not a commitment that wavers when immediate reactions are negative. It's not a commitment that expects any personal benefit to accrue. It is a commitment whose execution relies on the internal belief that acting so is simply the right thing to do. This is also something I learned at this law school. Let me talk a little bit about civil discourse, because I think that's out there in the public sphere now. The principle of academic freedom has long been the foundation of higher education. Implicit in this is the intellectual engagement in civil discourse by individuals with disparate viewpoints. The political rhetoric in this country today is troubling. I believe we should argue our causes and beliefs with passion but not rage. Each argument doesn't need to result in an epiphany. Rather, it should attempt to introduce new information, new viewpoints, and new elements which will further the conversation. With each new contribution to the conversation, however flawed or awkward, we can slowly and steadily move things forward. We as educators have an affirmative obligation to teach our students how to engage others who have a different point of view, passionately but respectfully. Democracy is a messy proposition. Addressing the challenges we face as a nation and world today is not easy. Change does not flow smoothly or easily. Views and perspectives about the human condition change slowly. History tells us that the most egregious examples of injustice in our democracy were not easily changed. We must speak out for justice. Nothing I say here rejects the impassioned effort to pursue justice. Indeed, as Dr. King wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. In the call the great social changes that have occurred in our history, and you will find in every case they took longer than we would have preferred. The abolition of slavery took time. The progress of Chicano farm workers under the leadership of Cesar Chavez took time. The struggle of the railroad porters who unionized under A. Philip Randolph took time. Addressing the plight of Chinese immigrants whose labor built the railroads took time, as did the injustice of the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And it took time to change Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Impatience with the pace of change is understandable, but civil discourse is the answer. This too is a lesson Dr. King taught us. As I mentioned before, during the 3 days Dr. King spent in that Birmingham jail, he wrote a letter that changed how our nation viewed civil rights. In his letter, he did not call for violence as a solution. Instead, Dr. King championed peaceful but persuasive civil discourse and action to bring about change. He did not demonize those who disagreed with his efforts. He let the moral force of his words and actions change hearts and minds. With this in mind, how then can we think our cause so just that our passions lead us to demonize others? We all need to take a deep breath and re-examine the rhetoric we use to argue for our beliefs as we seek to engage one another. Every perceived wrong by the government does not rise to the level of requiring insurrection. This was true in the 60s when it came from the left, and it's true now when it comes from the right. We need to respect court decisions and judges, even when we disagree with their decisions. Here in Iowa, we have removed 4 Supreme Court justices, not because they are evil, but because they had the temerity to look at the Iowa Constitution and find that gay people have a right to marry. And now there is a movement afoot to take the extraordinary steps of impeaching the rest of the justices. And we impeach them not for some crime or defect in character, but simply because there is disagreement with the decision they made. The solution in civilized society is not ideologically based witch hunt masquerading as impeachment, but the employment of words and reason through the discussion to seek change. President Obama remarked on this last week. I'll quote, "Let us use this occasion to expand our moral imaginations, to listen to each other more carefully, and to sharpen our instincts for empathy, and remind ourselves of all the ways our hopes and dreams are bound together. Our task of working together is to constantly widen our circle of concern so that we bequeath the American dream to future generations. They believed, and I believe, that we can be better. The single most effective way for our colleges and universities to contribute in positive ways to civil discourse is to teach our students to disagree passionately, but not to be disagreeable in the process. If we fail to instill this fundamental lesson to our students, then we will have failed our nation. A framework of discussion and debate produces understanding and compromise in a diverse and pluralistic society. As I wind down, let me thank you for being a great audience. And let me again remind this audience of how grateful I am for all this state, this university, and this law school have given to me. While I know I have worked hard to get where I am, I also know that it was the kindness and support of the people who I have encountered along the path of my life that have enriched me and enabled me to make a small contribution to the greater good. I believe in King's dream, and because of what has been given me, I have an optimistic belief in tomorrow. I know there is work to be done, but I also believe we can do better. I have a fundamental belief in our better angels, but I know we must fend off that part of our human nature which seeks to impede our progress. I know that in the final analysis, that it is and will be all of us, you and I, collectively, that will be responsible for continuing the very conditions and environment which allowed one orphan African-American kid in Iowa to become a university chancellor. Thank you.